Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Clifford Chance Perspective series and today's session on navigating cybersecurity and resilience in 2024. I hope you enjoyed the short holding video. Before we begin, I wanted to mention two housekeeping points. First is that the event is being recorded and all participants are automatically on mute. We know that you will have questions. We'll do our best to pick them up at the end of the session during the Q&A. And second, for those who require CLE credit, their verification code will be announced later in a session. So, welcome everyone. My name is Oscar Tang and I will be your moderator today. I'm a senior associate in the Clifford Chance Tech and Digital team in London and work with financial institutions, sponsors and corporates in a range of cyber matters, whether that's internal governance to regulatory engagement. Today's session is on cybersecurity and resilience, and as the description notes, there's been a global trend now towards increased cybersecurity and resilient regulation, and they will tighten existing requirements and affect a much broader range of businesses. We'll have updates from the US with the SEC and NYDFS cyber requirements to Singapore's proposed Cybersecurity Amendment Bill, and much more. So our esteemed panel will examine developments across the world from the US to APAC, Europe and the Middle East. But before we begin, can I hand the mic over for some introductions? Perhaps Megan, to you first.
Yes, hello. I'm Megan Gordon. I'm the co-head of our U.S. Data Privacy and Cybersecurity team, as well as the Office Managing Partner here in Washington. Very excited to speak with you all today.
I'm Holger Lutz. I'm heading the tech digital practice of Clifford Chance in Germany. And as such, I will, of course, focus on the European Union part of today's session. And I'm looking forward to spending the next approximately 45 minutes with you and hope that you will gain some useful insights on cybersecurity.
Hello, my name is David Olds. I'm counsel in the Clifford Chance Hong Kong office. I've been living and working in Asia since 1999. In Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Beijing, and in Yangon, of all places.
Here, my name is Alison Evans. I'm a counsel in the corporate practice in Dusseldorf. And prior to my time here, I spent a number of years working across the GCC in Qatar, Saudi, and Dubai on regulatory matters and with a particular focus on data protection, cybersecurity, and tech.
Thank you, everyone. Before I turn to the panelists with the questions, we thought it would be helpful to set the scene on cybersecurity and propose a way to how to think about it better, or perhaps more flexibly, because people think about it differently or have misconceptions about cybersecurity. And where I propose a starting point is one that many newcomers to cyber will encounter, which is what exactly is cybersecurity? And there doesn't seem to be a clear definition. And if you just take the security element of it, there's a bit of data security, there's a bit of computer security, there's also now increasingly national security. And already none of those areas are easy to define. Or perhaps we think about systems. Is it trusted or trustworthy systems, or resilience and risk? And what about other things that are adjacent and very important, like data protection and privacy? So it's difficult. But let's take a step back and think, what about the intuitive approach, what Daniel Kahneman might call system one thinking? So we all want security, so a system is secure if it is protected against all forms of threat. Sounds simple, but let's think about that. Can we stop hackers? Well, you've seen from all the headlines that that's pretty difficult. What about malware? With a diligent security team, yes, you probably get rid of most of it, but not all of it. What about nation-state hackers? They're just much more motivated hackers, and we'll all agree that I think stopping that will be pretty difficult. So that, let alone some unknown or undefined threat, that's just impossible. And you say, aha, let's set up a base on the moon, and we'll send to the moon backup tapes of all our documents and our cat videos. So even the intuitive approach is actually quite unhelpful. It's unachievable. No system really can be completely secure. So maybe how I think we could think about it is security is not really a computing or engineering problem. It's not the IT team will fix it. We can think about it maybe as an economics issue, a commercial problem. You have a problem that you can relate to. For example, how much do you spend on protecting your systems? How much investment do you want to make to train and prepare to respond? What that does mean, though, is that you have to define what state of security you want to be in. So, for example, if you're a critical infrastructure or a financial institution, you probably want to be in a better or higher state of security than most. That's quite easy, but you also have to define what failure means. What is a bad state of security for you? And that's difficult because you need stakeholder consensus around what that means. And that's even before you get to the undefinable states, the ones that you don't know and you can't predict, the Rumsfeld and unknown unknowns, the sending your tapes to the moon kind of scenario. But having a definition at least means that you can have quantifiable and measurable outcomes. You can design and operate your systems to that outcome. You can communicate sensibly about it, and then you can develop policies and tools to achieve it. Because if you don't define it and it's undefined, you can't even be incorrect. You can just be surprised. And actually, most security problems, I would say, are problems not of failure. They're just surprising. And everyone is perpetually surprised if you don't have that definition. So what can we do about it? We'll take it back to basics. We define what the appropriate level of security specific to you and what you need is. And once you understand how to achieve it, then you know what you should do about it. And what we really mean when we talk about risk is perhaps that. It sounds simple, but you do need then a grasp of a range of issues that different teams or departments need to deal with. For example, thinking about how much investment can you actually muster up, and what actions should you and your team actually take. And also importantly, will the regulator agree with you about your definition of an appropriate state of security? So with that perhaps framework in mind, I think that's where we can begin, and we'll turn to our expert panel for their thoughts and about how companies are responding to the growing landscape of cybersecurity regulation. So Megan, maybe I can start with you. There's been an increased trend towards talking about risk and resilience and focus about bringing it to a much higher and higher level. We've been talking about cyber as a board level issue for some time now. And so Megan, what keeps this on the board agenda? Many companies have compliance programs. What matters should they be paying attention to?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Oscar. I think it's a really important one right now. I think that this has been a board level issue for a long time, but it's recently become even more important. There's a few reasons for that. First, the fines have gotten larger. The expectations in the community have also gotten larger because the public now expects companies to treat this as an important issue. We've seen major cyber attacks for years now. But another thing that's really happening is that cybersecurity is also, in terms of it being a board level issue, is being really regulated as such. And in particular, I wanted to bring up in the US, there was a recent regulation that came about this year. It put in place, which requires US publicly listed companies as well as foreign private issuers in the US to have a cybersecurity disclosure program in place, talk about how their cybersecurity is managed throughout the company, and it has a specific requirement for board involvement with cybersecurity. So not only is this important just because of the material risk associated with cybersecurity, but it's also important because it's now become a regulated issue when it comes to cybersecurity and what regulators expect companies to do. And because of that, we've seen boards really become active in this, asking a lot of questions when it comes to cybersecurity, doing more than just saying, do we have a program in place? We're really understanding how it works, whether third parties are used, and digging into the supply chain risk management and how cybersecurity goes in an enterprise-wide level. There's also additional accountability when it comes to the board and cybersecurity, which is another reason why they're looking at it. They're really, the way that regulations are pushing it is that it's going up to the board to really treat this as a material issue. And with that, I think that we can see that it's really becoming really a really material issue for everybody, and from a regulatory perspective, boards are going to need to do this in the future and look at cybersecurity very intensely.
Thank you, Megan. Holger, perhaps turning to the European side, are you seeing a similar area of focus? Like how is the European landscape adding to this worldwide?
Actually, yes, we do. The situation is pretty similar to the US. So on the factual level, we see also more and more sophisticated attacks, right, which in turn raise public awareness and of course, I mean, most of the incidents, most of the attacks are global of nature, right? So by nature, so it's clear that we have this similar factual background or level. And on the legal side, also we have a lot of developments on the European Union level. So the EU legislator becomes more and more active in trying to also increase the level of cybersecurity in various sectors. Like just at the end of 2022, we had a bunch of European legislation. So, for example, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, the DORA, was published together with the Network and Information Security Directive 2, the NIS2 directive, and the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, CER. They've all been published at the end of 2022, and they are now coming into force. Basically, one after the others. The directives have to be implemented into national laws, of course. And in addition, there's also discussions on a new Cyber Resilience Act, not yet enacted, not yet published in the official journal, but the discussions on it are pretty well advanced. And that's just the stuff that is basically new and about to come. But we must not forget that we already have a pretty high level of regulatory requirements in the European Union. The best example from my perspective is the General Data Protection Regulation. It's focusing on personal data, yes, and it applies since 2018 already. But as you might know, the GDPR requires controllers and processors to implement and maintain adequate technical and organizational security measures. It's focused on the protection of personal data, yes, but I mean, most companies are processing quite large amounts of personal data. So that is one of the main bodies of law that are already existing, in addition to the NIS1 directive and the local implementations. And since the GDPR is in force already a couple of years, we already have not only legislation, but jurisdiction and court decisions interpreting it, right? And just recently, we've seen an ECJ decision defining or holding that the fear of a potential misuse of personal data, such as in case of a cyber attack where data is basically exfiltrated, can constitute a non-material damage in the meaning of the GDPR. And we already see the consequences of this decision in a way that more and more data subjects are actually trying to get some money out of companies after a data breach or a cyber incident. So the companies are not only hit by the outfall or the fallout of the breach of the incident, but they then have to fight with the data subjects with regard to damage claims. One example we've seen last year is that approximately 50 employees claimed 5,000 euros each from their employer because there was a cyber incident, right? And that's kind of potentially picking up in the future.
Thank you, Holger. Maybe turning to David and Alison with the points raised by Megan and Holger, especially around a broader range of businesses being caught by regulation, the continuing data regulatory space, especially with the new decisions coming out, and a focus on managing cyber risk, perhaps also along the supply chain. Are we seeing the same things in APAC and the Middle East?
Well, I'll go first for APAC. Almost all jurisdictions in Asia these days have some sort of data privacy regulation, and increasingly those data privacy regulations contain some kind of notification provision. We have seen Indonesia, Vietnam, and even Singapore expand and beef up the scope of its notification requirements recently. So in that sense, we're seeing more countries coming on board with some kind of cybersecurity regulation in place. We're also seeing across the region different types of entities and different types of incidents which are being regulated. There's sort of an increase in who gets covered by this. And there's a lot of regulation already in place around critical information infrastructure. And there are proposals underway in Australia to change the existing cybersecurity infrastructure legislation so as to include new types of operators like telecommunications operators who were previously regulated under their own separate regime. There's also a proposal in Australia to create a mandatory ransomware notification requirement to gather more information on that kind of incident. So an increase in the types of incidents which have to be reported. In Singapore, there is a Cybersecurity Amendment Bill which has just been read into Parliament at the beginning of the month, and it will significantly expand the types of regulated entities under the regime. It will include people like foundational data infrastructure providers, cloud service providers and the like, who will now have to comply with a range of requirements that include notification of a cybersecurity incident, compliance with guidelines published by the Cybersecurity Regulatory, the CSA, the Cybersecurity Association, and also a need to submit themselves to audit at particular points in time. So we're seeing expansions both across the countries included, the entities included, and the types of incidents that are included.
I'm really happy to add some nuance about how these same trends are playing out across the Middle East. And by Middle East, I'm really referring to GCC countries particularly, with some specific examples out of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. To set the scene, the total cost of data breaches reached $8 million in 2023, with the average cost of cyber attacks for organizations really above the global average for Middle East entities. And the two top industries for threat actors were identified to be public administration and e-commerce entities. With that in mind, there's three things that influence public policy development of cybersecurity frameworks for the Middle East, and briefly discussing these will set the scene for understanding where things are at and what's coming. The three things are, as everybody's mentioned, safeguarding critical infrastructure, unique to the Middle East, safeguarding national security, and safeguarding data as a national resource are both public policy drivers. In terms of critical infrastructure, the unique natural resources in the region means that oil and natural gas infrastructure entities are really attractive facilities for threat actors, and protective efforts have really started there to prioritise that protection. Any threat to those entities would have local and far-reaching global consequences. And whilst I'm absolutely not qualified to comment on the complex geopolitical issues, it would be remiss not to recognise their impact when combined with the political landscape, the strategic geographical location, and those natural resources. Cybersecurity is important, but I see that there are competing priorities with implementation of national vision strategies, outside investments, the rapid pace of digitization, innovations. Basically, there is lots going on in the space. And finally, recognition of data as a national resource has underpinned regulatory obligations, particularly around localization. Frameworks for cybersecurity have been in place for a few years now, and in nearly all of our advice to clients, we've had to address how client compliance programs might need to adapt to stricter localization requirements. And while we are seeing some evolution of these as the newer data protection regimes are implemented, it is still a key policy driver. So take, for example, the Saudi Arabian draft data sovereignty public policy, which was released for consultation last month. Its first principle is recognition of data as a national asset. By way of breach reports, as recently as January 2024, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Saudi faced a major data breach, exposing really the inner workings of the ministry, and we know what the threat to national security would be there for diplomatic relations as well. Gathering information about regulatory activity is a little difficult still. Even if general announcements are coming out of ministries, specific details are not necessarily released in the same way that we might have information in other jurisdictions. But I really think that is something that is going to change as data protection laws really embed. So with that in mind, let's loop back to the original points about how businesses are affected and managing supply chain risk. Financial services is a primary ransomware target. In the public sector, any arrangements where entities are having to transfer data to third-party contractors, particularly under public-private partnerships. These are presenting a key risk, and there are notable examples of cyber attacks on, say, Saudi Aramco over the last few years. So what's next? Well, for the region, there's a real need for additional expertise. Regulatory framework for cybersecurity are going to evolve in lockstep with the full practical implementation of data protection regimes. Regulators are really prioritizing clear documentation for entities to align with international best practice, what's going on everywhere else. And they're open for discussions with regulated entities and for collaboration. For example, the UAE Cybersecurity Council collaborated with KPMG to explore the future of cybersecurity over the next 50 years, highlighting potential policy decisions that the UAE might consider to maximize its cyber resilience. Staying on top of regional nuance is going to be really important. It's going to be a continuing compliance challenge, especially for those global entities where compliance programs are EU or US-centric to begin with. And last but not least, it would be an understatement to say fintech is rapidly expanding. In the unique socio-economic environment, it has brought huge benefits, particularly for retail banking. There are undoubtedly some new challenges to ensure adequate protections are in place for the large amounts of sensitive data that's now being exchanged, especially where entities that are not regarded as part of that critical infrastructure framework might be starting to manage that data.
Thank you, Alison. Meg and Holger, maybe picking up some of these business-facing points and requirements, what about supply chain risk management in the US and the EU? Are you seeing contracting requirements and supplier risk assessments being required?
Happy to take that one first, Oscar. We are definitely seeing supply chain requirements coming into place. From the US perspective, generally take the position that you're pretty much responsible in some way for your supply chain. So you can't just turn a blind eye, kind of ostrich in the sand type of approach when it comes to supply chain management. We see the NIST standards, and I know that these are applied outside of the US as well, specifically get into supply chain management. You know, for example, the NIST standards say that security requirements should be included in the RFP in every contract. There should also be once a vendor is accepted, having a security team work with them on site to address any vulnerabilities, having a one strike and you're out policy when it comes to vendor products, and a bunch of other standards. But this really goes to the fact that cybersecurity in risk management is really important. And I think I'd be remiss not to mention when it comes to supply chain, the US has also recently, at least from the connected car section side of the world, actually put out some proposals regarding how the data collection in the supply chain and where that data is collected and access to that data is allowed will be permitted in the future. This really goes into kind of the US-China, I am the only one who calls it this, but I like to call it data wars, is going about. And so access to data, supply chain access to data, how that supply chain works is important in the future. So I think that these are, becoming more and more important. We know that when in a cyber incident, often it's a third party's, something happens to a third party where they're attacked, and then it's going to impact just a number of different clients across a bunch of different industries. So when we see one of those linchpin third parties or supply chain parts of the supply chain be attacked, we see it just impacting a wide swath of different clients and customers. And I can say, going through a lot of these, the issues that our clients have when they speak to third parties is often trying to receive information about what data of theirs has actually been impacted, so they can see if they themselves have disclosure, notification requirements, etc. So this is a huge issue. It's probably one of the most difficult ones to actually risk manage, but we see it a lot. So that's what's happening on the US side, but I know, Holger, you have some more from the EU perspective.
Yeah, in the EU as well, even the regulatory and the legislator focus is actually shifting to the supply chain, right? We have seen in the past, coming back to my GDPR example, the focus was mostly on the controller, and yes, on the processor side as well with regard to technical and organizational measures. But in the last kind of security-related legislations I've mentioned before, there's an actual focus on that supply chain risk. So coming back to DORA, for example, for the financial institutions, there's an entire chapter dealing with management of third-party risk, right? And financial entities are, among others, required to conduct audits and inspections of their third-party service providers, of the ICT, so information and communication service providers, which is a pretty broad term. So they have to do that basically across all third-party providers of ICT services. And also the other acts, such as the Network and Information Security Directive 2, expressly states that essential and important entities take appropriate cybersecurity measures that shall include at least supply chain security. So again, a shift also to the supply chain. And the CR directive also states that entities shall take into account the personnel of external service providers when setting out specific categories of personnel who exercise critical functions. So again, you see a shift to the supply chain.
Yeah, and just picking up off of one of those points, Holger, similarly in the U.S., similar to what you're saying, somewhat similarly to DORA, the SEC cybersecurity rule actually also specifically states that you have to talk about your third-party management in your cybersecurity process. So kind of that specificity in legislation, it seems like we're seeing on both sides of the pond.
Thanks, Megan. Holger, maybe picking up on the point about regulation, and there's an area in cyber where, of course, laws have traditionally regulated, which is imposing reporting and notification requirements. And we've been seeing some change and some movement in that space in relation to incident management and response. What have you seen, and how do you think that will impact global businesses?
Well, in the past, affected entities have mainly focused on two things, right? One is getting the respective issue under control, so get the incident under control from a factual perspective. And then secondly, try to comply with applicable notification obligations from a legal perspective, right? In order to prevent any kind of fines or contractual claims resulting from that. And in many sectors, we have seen at least that the companies focused on notification obligations in the European Union under the General Data Protection Regulation, right? Because that was the regulation with the largest fines behind it if you mess up with the notification obligations. And as you know, the GDPR contains a notification obligation to notify data protection authorities of a so-called personal data breach within 72 hours, so already a very tight deadline. And what we have seen in the past, the discussion was always this deadline commences upon the controller having become aware of the personal data breach, and hence we had a lot of discussions circling around the question as to when sufficient knowledge has been existing. Under DORA, again, the time limits for notification obligations will be regulated in so-called Common Draft Regulatory Standards, RTSs, and they are currently only available in draft version, but the latest version on the notification obligations that foresees an initial notification to be submitted within 4 hours from the moment of classification of the incident as a major incident, but no later than 24 hours from the time of detection. So you see, you will have an additional layer of notification obligation, slightly different scope. So not a personal data breach being the trigger, but a cyber threat or a cyber incident being the trigger, but having different notification obligations and a different scope. So the tricky thing in the future will be to basically track down all the notification requirements in case a breach or an incident happens, in order to be able for the company to actually comply, not with all of the notification obligations. I think that's virtually impossible. India has some obligations to notify within an hour, which is kind of failure by definition, basically, but with as many as possible, right? And you need some kind of an update to the playbook in order to be able to comply with as many notification obligations as possible in the future.
I would add that the Cybersecurity Authority in China published some draft measures back in late last year, which also had a 1-hour notification requirements for certain types of incidents. They're only draft measures. We're not sure if they're going to come into force, but it's a very strict test to take. I must confess I am a junkie for cybersecurity decisions and case law, because they always contain like a little story, their own little tale of woe. And as you were talking, Holger, I was thinking of a one particular one in Singapore, which is a really good example of how that organizational failure to realize when the incident happened, when you can pinpoint when the organization was aware. And that's the case of Sing Health in 2018, so quite an old decision now. And it begins, depressingly enough, with the spear phishing attack on a single terminal. And it ends up with 1.5 million health records being disclosed, including that of the Prime Minister, and the largest fine in Singapore history, even to now, 1 million Singapore dollars. The thing that, as you were speaking, that occurred to me was that the Committee of Inquiry examined in great detail what the organisation knew when, who knew what when was a key factor. And it was pretty clear that the junior staff realised something weird was happening in the system quite early on. And they reported it up to middle managers. And the middle managers had the erroneous view that they had to gather all the information. They had to know everything about the incident before they would report it upwards. It also looks like they were concerned about the amount of work that would follow once they made that report upwards to their senior management. So they spun their wheels for a period, and the Committee of Inquiry made a comment about them, middle management mistakes smothering the initiative of the junior staff who spotted the incident. But once the incident was reported to senior management, notification was made really quickly to the relevant authorities. And the regulators had a lot of criticism for the middle managers who had spun their wheels, but they also had criticism, which I think links back to Megan's first point. They had a lot of criticism for the senior management for not actually having a system in place that made sure there were adequate staff who were properly trained, who understood their roles and responsibilities. It's a tale of woe across the organisation, which is why I kind of like it as an example. But it does show the importance of being organisationally prepared for a cybersecurity incident. The other one, because I am a junkie and I won't go into detail, is the Razor and Capgemini case, which is a really good example of supply chain risk, where there's a dispute as to who had what responsibilities for cybersecurity between a customer and a service provider. And if you're interested, that's a really good case to read to map why you need to be very careful in your IT services contracts.
Thanks, David. That's very, very interesting. And it's something also, especially on the regulatory side, we're seeing regulators becoming increasingly savvy in dealing with these incidents and enforcing against them. And in the recent or distant past, depending on which standard you're applying, like computing standards, the regulators used to be a little bit more lenient, and generally you could argue that the victim organization was, a victim. But I think maybe, Megan, we've seen some major fines now in the past few years for lax security.
Yeah, we definitely have, and I think the U.S. likes to, I always have felt likes to kind of regulate through enforcement actions, and we've seen that in this case as well. I should mention before I go into some of the fines that I was recently at a convention, and the head of the California Data Protection Office, by the way, our first state data protection office. I know for those in Europe that seems a little behind the curve, but they are indeed our first one. In any case, he said during that discussion that the gloves are now off when it comes to enforcement, which was kind of funny because I don't think that any of us ever thought from California's perspective that the gloves were really on. But in any case, that's just to note that was kind of a recent statement from one of our conferences a couple weeks ago. But when it comes to enforcement actions in the U.S., if we were to do kind of a top 10 list, the one that still is number one is really the Facebook action, which is an older one. It's from 2019. It was a $5 billion fine levied by the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of the federal agencies that regulates cybersecurity. And this really had to go with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, as some may remember, during the 2016 election cycle, although we're in a new election cycle 8 years later now. In any case, that one ended up actually being reduced to $725 million in court. I mean, still, it's not pennies, but reduced from the $5 billion amount. We've had a lot of other fines. I just wanted to mention one more because this, as in the U.S., cybersecurity is regulated both federally as well as by the states, and the New York Department of Financial Services has been really at the forefront of this when it comes to financial institution regulation. They have their own cybersecurity requirements. They have a very fast notification requirement. They also have, kind of following up on some of David's points about kind of requirements on the board, they have a certification requirement from management that their cybersecurity program is totally fine and in place. In any case, they recently fined a financial group called eMain Financial Group, also OneMain, to pay $4.25 million to settle a violation under their cybersecurity regulations. And that was about improperly storing passwords, not sufficiently managing risks from third-party data storage. There we go, third parties again. We keep hearing about supply chain. And they, as part of this, they agreed to significant remediation measures in the settlement. $4.25 million is not a huge settlement in the U.S., but this is one state financial regulator, right? So if you think about how many regulators can kind of hop on to these types of enforcement actions, it can get quite large. And I'd also be remiss when we talk about kind of fines and enforcement actions. The private bar, in particular in the U.S., when it comes to cybersecurity breaches, is, I can say, it's very well established now. There's a whole group of private plaintiffs' attorneys that will now go and bring actions against companies. So I can just say that they are active. And they know exactly how to bring these types of actions, and they do it quite often. So it's not just the potential for regulatory enforcement, but it's also the potential for kind of the private actions that can follow on to that. I can say Marriott is still litigating their breach, which was from a number of years ago. So, interesting stuff. I think you're going to see a lot more enforcement actions coming up in the future, because that's what we're hearing from everyone.
Interesting. I mean, you made the point on US versus European Union, and even though in the European Union we are historically much heavier regulated on the privacy side, right? We haven't reached the level of fines as you mentioned in the US, right? So that's a little bit extreme. So you have this kind of a lower number of fines, I guess, until now at least. But if you are hit in the US, then you're really hit. In the EU, the number of fines that have been issued is for cybersecurity related breaches, I would call it, mostly under the GDPR, and the reason was insufficient technical and organizational security measures. That is much higher. However, the amount of fines is lower. So I've just looked it up. For the last 2 years, I found kind of 20, 30 different fines, and the top 10 circle around 1 million and 7 million. It seems to be extremely hot in Spain, right? I found 6 million fines, one 5 million fine and 1 6 million fine in Spain, but we've also seen 5 million fines in the UK. Even in Greece, I've found a fine for a large telco operator for insufficient technical and organizational measures of 3 million, as I said, and so forth. So the number of fines is higher, but a little bit more reasonable in the amounts. As mentioned before, I think one of the main developments, which is a prediction for the next couple of months and years, is that companies will not only have to deal with the fines, but also with the private claims. As I mentioned before, damage claims from the data subjects. For immaterial damage, material damage is mostly difficult to prove, but immaterial damage claims that might might rise in the future.
Thanks, Holger. And picking up maybe on predictions, obviously there's a lot of movement in the cybersecurity space, but there's also one other big development influencing a lot of the tech landscape right now, artificial intelligence. So is AI changing the cyber threat landscape and the security standards? What are organizations and regulators doing in the space?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Oscar. So us even just doing this this presentation today, it makes me think that this will now be online, and there will be more content for AI to bring of us, and thus, you know, the risk associated with deep fakes just keeps increasing. So, you know, if they are recording right now, David or Alison, and they can then, you know, make a video call or something pretending to be them, AI can. So it's a very interesting time. Well, but I think AI is really a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's AI products now in cybersecurity that can help identify and root out threat actors. So that's a positive development. On the other side of that, it's, you know, being able to mimic voices, video, email, how people write, any of those types of things help to really enhance threat actors. You know, having bots go and do different types of way to penetrate systems. And I always say, I'm like, it feels like we're in the Matrix, or we're moving into the Matrix or something now with the amount of content that is out there. It's kind of interesting. I think that AI is coming off of the back of kind of a large social media presence that a lot of people have. So the amount of data out there probably on you, or videos that people have posted or anything like that is really pretty high. So the ability for AI to take that and potentially use it also increases because of the amount of data and social presence that a lot of people have. So I think AI is going to play on both sides of this, but certainly it's going to have a huge impact going forward, and hopefully, as we would say, kind of the good guys will outpace the bad guys on this, but you never know.
I mean, it's an interesting area to watch globally, but from the UAE, Saudi Arabian perspective, they're moving really quickly to expand their national AI capabilities, as well as introducing regulatory frameworks for new technologies. They're both pioneering regional adoption of AI in the Middle East and have recognized the strategic importance of it in changing their long-term economic and security goals, you know, linking back to those national visions that I mentioned earlier. Both nations have established dedicated AI councils, so that taking a formalistic approach to considering how it's going to be embedded in the jurisdictions. Most recently with the establishment of the Abu Dhabi AI and Advanced Technology Council. In that space, cross-regional collaboration is going to become increasingly important to drive both security and build trust across the region.
Thanks, Alison and Megan. That's super interesting because there's clearly a lot of change afoot, especially with AI. But maybe bringing back finally to one of the points I was talking earlier, and also Holger, which is the risk profile. And a lot of the historic regulation has been sectoral, targeting critical infrastructure or financial institutions. And you know, in Europe, for example, we've had the NIS regime now for several years, and those are the traditional high-risk sectors. In the updated version of NIS 2, that also gets expanded into banking specifically. Maybe Holger, to you, how do you see that changing or developing over the next 12 months and beyond?
Over the next 12 months, I think, I mean, DORA has just come into force, right? And most of the DORA-related obligations for the financial services sector, they kick in on 17th of January next year, so approximately 9 months ahead. So in the financial service sector, many companies, many financial entities are currently just focusing on DORA implementation and ramping up their policies and requirements in that regard. The tricky thing with DORA, but also with NIS 2 and the local implementations, is that not all of the required changes and amendments are limited to internal processes. So, for example, coming back to DORA again, it also imposes certain minimum requirements for the contractual arrangements with the third-party service providers. So, and some of these requirements also relate to cyber incidents or IT incidents, and will have to be implemented into the relevant contracts. And as mentioned before, DORA will apply as of 17th of January next year, for 9 months ahead. And I mean, most financial entities, they have quite a number of ICT third-party service providers, right? So that's not only, we're not only talking about 1, 2, 3, 5 contracts to be amended. And the only good news is that the regulators are aware of that as well, right? And we have, for example, spoken with the German financial service regulator, the BaFin, and they expressly acknowledge this kind of dilemma, right? That a large bank has more than 1,000 contracts to be amended, and they said, well, they will not start kicking in with fines as of day one, right? As of 18th of January next year, but they urged the companies to take a reasonable decision on which contracts to start with. So look at the biggest and most critical contracts, of course, but take a reasonable approach and really speed up, because 9 months for more than 100 or more than 1,000 contracts is also a pretty tight deadline anyhow, and you should have a couple of them amended at least until January next year.
I see the same patterns in Singapore from the Cybersecurity Amendment Act, which is currently under consideration. But from the reverse perspective, that because that act increases the number of entities who may be regulated and imposes obligations on them in relation to cybersecurity, that those entities are going to need to renegotiate their contracts with their financial institutions' customers in order to make sure that they can comply with the new legal requirements. And that's going to be a real challenge, because when the requirements are things like audit and providing information, it's going to run contrary to the natural secrecy that banks have maintained around how their security systems work.
Thanks, David and Holger. I think we're coming up to the hour, so I want to leave some time for at least 1 or 2 questions. So perhaps we could wrap up and ask you for one takeaway from you before we turn to the questions. Megan, perhaps I could ask you to take that one first.
Happy to. I think my takeaway is that cybersecurity is an enterprise level problem now. So it's not just about IT, it's not just about the legal department, it's really about all groups working together and treating it as a significant enterprise-wide risk and moving forward in that way.
I think my takeaway is the same as Megan's. That really is that cybersecurity begins at home. It's about being prepared for the incident and planning for the incident and making sure that everyone in your organization knows what is happening, so that you don't get something like Sing Health where you're smothered by mistakes by middle management, that everyone knows what their role is and what they need to do.
Building on that, be prepared to address regional nuances across different regimes. If your compliance program is EU or US centric and you're doing business in the Middle East, have systematic ways to undertake some kind of gap analysis internally so you can address these regional nuances in a way that's appropriate for your organization, particularly where those regulatory environments are ones that implement data sovereignty policies or may have strict localization requirements or cross-border restrictions around cross-border transfers.
I would just re-emphasize that especially financial entities should start early, or basically now, with their activities requiring cooperation from third parties. So whatever you can't do only internally, please move that forward on your schedule, because that might take some time. And coming back to Alison's point, most of the companies are global by nature, right, or regional at least. And one of the trickiest things is to consider the different obligations, especially notification obligations across the globe. So that should also be taken care of pretty early in the process, that you have some kind of a matrix and overlay of these notification obligations in order to actually match most of them or many of them if an incident actually occurs.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for valuable insights today. Now, for the moment that everyone's been waiting for, if you require CLE credit, the verification code for this session is Cybersecurity 1804. So that's capital C, no space, Cybersecurity 1804. With that, in the last 5 minutes, I think we could perhaps pick up one or two questions for the panelists. Perhaps one about data protection, because that was discussed in passing as well. There's a question about stringent data protection laws and how to balance that against having very robust measures. And I don't know if any of the panelists want to pick up the perhaps sometimes conflicting incentives between data protection and cybersecurity.
Oscar, I'm happy to contribute something there. I think the more data you have, the bigger your exposure to cyber attacks. And maybe that's really trite, but I think when we're looking at it from through a data protection lens and personal data protection lens, over collection and over retention of data have been common compliance challenges. And I think as the new regimes in the Middle East start to be practically implemented in a more active way, entities may need to adjust their mindsets to really focus on what implementation of data minimization really looks like in practice for their organization. And I think in that way, it's a simple thing you can do to reduce your exposure to cybersecurity risks.
Thanks, Alison. There's also a question about cooperation in cybersecurity and perhaps competition concerns. So some of the regulations will be requiring you to report to authorities, but also increasingly share information about threats between entities. Do we have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can add one point. That the sharing of information on breaches or on incidents is also taken care of or also noticed by the legislator, right? So again, for example, the DORA regulation contains an article expressly allowing or facilitating the sharing of information between financial entities, and that's basically a reflection of what we've already seen in the past, right? Because many companies have kind of created some kind of informal information sharing circles whenever a certain threat was notified by one of the larger companies in the European market. They tried to share that information with other companies, and of course, you always have that risk of kind of being in breach of competition law for sharing sensitive information, but the legislator seems to see that and tries to facilitate that because cybersecurity is seen to be more important in the end as a kind of remote risk of a breach of competition law by sharing this information. Of course, you can't use these exceptions to share competitively sensitive information, but they acknowledge that the protection prevails, basically.
It's interesting because in the APAC part of the world, information sharing is actively encouraged. The Cybersecurity Agency in Singapore publishes an annual report where they've gathered all the information and they give statistics about what's been happening. The Hong Kong PDPC publishes a cybersecurity readiness index every year that says, this is what sectors are interested. And in Australia, the government's 2023-2030 cybersecurity, what's it called? The cybersecurity policy, it states that they want to encourage information sharing because they see there's a way of building up resiliency across the economy.
Thank you. Definitely a diversity of approaches, and hopefully increasing information sharing and transparency can only help everybody. And with that, and a minute to go to the hour, thank you very much for attending, and I think I can draw today's session to a close. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.